Welcome to the instruction tape for your new knitting machine. This tape will show you in easy-to-follow steps how to get the most from your machine. You will see how to knit a wide range of medium and thick yarns usually associated with hand knitting. Just as easily, you will knit fine yarns for more elegant wear, and of course all those exciting, modern, fancy yarns with knobs and lashes. To familiarize yourself with your new machine, just follow this tape as we show you the basic techniques you need to know. Later, you will be able to create your own patterns or adapt them from books or magazines. This videotape is designed for you to learn at your own pace. At certain points, the tape has a built-in pause to allow you to complete a task or to review what has just been explained. When this picture appears on your screen, you have enough time to turn off the video set and complete the task that has just been explained. If necessary, rewind the tape and watch it once more. Lay your machine on a steady table. The striking combs are facing you. Take the row counter from the styrofoam block. Tilt the needle bed forward. In the rail at the back edge of the needle bed, there is a plastic guide. Take the row counter in your hand. Now you can insert its holding rail into the plastic guide. The holding rail and plastic guide have to be matched exactly. Now you can tilt the row counter backward until it clicks into place. Look at the 0 on the stitch scale. Slide the row counter to the center of the machine. Each time when you move the lock over the needle bed to knit one row, the row counter will count this row. When you have finished your knitting and you want to set the row counter back to 0, pull the small lever to the right. You can change each number individually by turning the knobs. Push your machine to the edge of the table to fix it there. The sockets for fixing the machine must be to the edge of the table. Fasten the machine with the table clamps. Screw them up tightly. If your table is too short, insert the clamps in the stirrups towards the center of the machine. Now the lock can be removed by sliding it to the end of the machine. Use the oil tube from the styrofoam block to drip oil onto the needle feet and the front and back guide rail of the needle bed. This machine comes with 2 different sized sets of striking combs to knit thick and fine yarns. As you unpack the machine, the wider spaced ones should be in place. To remove them, pull the retaining rod out sideways at each end of the needle bed. Now you can lift out the 2 segments of the striking comb on this half of the machine. Take the finer one and compare the 2. The narrow-spaced one is used for finer wool, for which you would use hand knitting needles size 3 to 4 or less. The wider spaced one is used for thicker wool, which you would knit with hand knitting needles size 5 to 6 or more. You knit in exactly the same way on the machine, regardless of whether it is fitted with the wide or the narrow spaced comb. Because the stitches will be bigger and therefore easier to see when you use a thicker wool, we will start knitting with the wider spaced comb. To put the striking comb back on the machine, fit the supports of the different sections of the comb into the slots at the front of the machine. Hold the comb down while you insert the retaining rod. To slide the lock back again onto the needle bed, tilt it backwards and fit the guide rail of the lock into the back rail of the needle bed. Tilt the lock to the front. Make sure that the brushes of the lock go under the striking comb. The needles against the rear guide rail are in the non-working position. When the needle foot matches the marks on the needle bed, the needles are in the advanced working position. For your first steps, use 2 balls of different colored yarns for which needle size 5 or 6 millimeters is recommended. Take a look at the stitch scale on the guide rails. The upper half counts the needles that are in the advanced working position when you knit with the wide gauge striking comb. The lower half counts the needles that are in the advanced working position when you knit with the narrow gauge striking comb. Push every alternate needle of the needles that will be working with the wide-spaced striking comb to the advanced working position, starting with needle 14 at the right of center. For this, you can use the side marked C of pattern ruler BC. The last needle to be pushed into the advanced working position is needle 15 at the left of center. Make absolutely sure that every single latch of the needles in the advanced working position is open. Every closed latch will invariably lead to a dropped stitch. From a ball of your yarn, unwind a length of yarn 3 times the width across which you will be knitting. Start laying it across from the right into the open needle heads so that the loose yarn end is on the left. The knitting switch is the switch at the back of the lock. Push it towards you. The round dial on the lock is for regulating the stitch size. Set it to 5. Move the lock across the needles to the left. At the beginning, hold the yarn lightly at the right side until the lock has passed over the first needles. Pick up one section of the casting on comb. The sections of the casting on comb can be fixed together. The casting on comb always has to be at least as long as the section of the machine over which you are going to knit. For now, one section of the casting on comb is sufficient. Hold the comb to the front of the machine with the teeth bent towards the machine and take care that the ends of the wool at right and left run over the comb. Hang the comb in such a way that a hook always catches a loop of yarn where a needle is out of work. Fasten the loose left end of the yarn in the yarn clamp of the casting on comb. Push the knitting switch back away from you. Move the lock from left to right over the needles. Note that the needles are now again in the advanced working position. Push the needles in between also into the working position. Push an additional needle into the advanced working position at the right edge. Make sure that all the latches are open. Lay the yarn from right to left into the open needle heads. Move the lock across the needles from the right to the left. You have now completed the cast-on, and you can go on knitting stocking stitch. For each row, lay the yarn over the open needles and move the lock across. Remember, always watch that the latches of the needles are open. Knit several rows to get the feeling. Increases and decreases can be done in different ways. Let's start with the simple increase. On the yarn side, bring one more needle into the knitting position. Lay the yarn on this needle and across the other needles and knit the row. You have completed one simple increase. Never forget to make sure that the latch of the needle is open. The simple decrease can be done on both sides of the knitting at the same time. Take the decker holder with one decker. Insert the eyelet of the decker into the second needle head. Push the needle to the back until the stitch is on the shaft of the decker. Tilt the decker up and back until the stitch slips into the needle head. Unhook the decker and insert its eyelet into the head of the first needle. Push the decker to the back until the stitch is on the shaft of the decker. Unhook the decker and transfer the stitch to the second needle. Tilt the decker to the back until the stitch slips into the needle head. Push the needle with the two stitches again into the advanced working position and push the empty needle to the back out of work. Go on knitting. Do several of these decreases on each side of the knitting to get some practice. Knit 2 rows between each decrease. You can also make Italian or fully fashioned increases or decreases. To make an increase, put 2 decker needles into the holder for decker needles. Push the next empty needle to the front edge of the needle bed. Insert the eyelet of the 2 decker needles into the heads of the 2 last needles with stitches. Push the needles to the back until the stitches are on the shaft of the deckers. Unhook the decker needles and transfer the 2 stitches 1 needle away from the knitting. Tilt the decker needles up and back until the stitches slip into the new needle heads. With 1 decker needle, pick up the purl stitch loop of the second stitch and hang it on this needle. Bring the 3 needles into the knitting position. Make several increases at each side of your knitting to get a little practice. Knit 2 rows between each increase. You can also make an Italian or fully fashioned decrease. Take the decker holder with one decker and bring the third stitch from the edge into the needle head. Now take the decker holder with two deckers. Push the needles to the back until the stitches are on the shaft of the deckers. Transfer the two stitches one stitch towards the inside of the knitting. Tilt the deckers up and to the back to let the stitches slide into the needle heads. Push the empty needle to the back and the two needles with stitches into the advanced working position. Knit 2 rows and repeat this operation several times. The following method of decreasing several stitches can also be used for casting off all the stitches. It must be done on the yarn side. Hang into the needle hooks the number of stitches you wish to decrease, for example, 6 stitches. Transfer the first stitch onto the next needle with one decker. Push that needle with the 2 stitches on it to the front until the stitches are behind the open latch. Now wind the yarn with which you have been knitting round the needle and pull the needle to the back to form a new stitch. This new stitch is now transferred to the next needle and the operation is repeated for each stitch to be cast off. The empty needles must always be pushed to the back, bringing them to the non-working position. If you want to cast off all the stitches, it's easier to bring the stitches into the needle heads as follows. Knit 1 row as usual. Knit the next row with the knitting switch pushed to the front. Now all the stitches are in the needle hooks and you can go on as explained before. You have begun your first exercise with a simple cast-on. Of course, you will never begin a sweater like this. A sweater starts with a mock rib. Cast on using contrast yarn. For this, you can use an oddment of yarn similar in thickness to the one you're going to use as your main yarn, but in a different color. Repeat again the same cast-on over 32 needles as shown at the beginning of this tape. Review the tape to have another look at it or consult your knitting guide, pages 8 and 9. Have you completed your cast on? Now knit 5 rows with contrast yarn. Now drop every third stitch by pulling the needle to the back out of the working position. Knit 2 more rows with contrast yarn. Change now to the main yarn and knit the required number of rows. For our exercise, 19 rows will do. Knit 1 more row with the knitting switch pulled towards you. Push the knitting switch again to the back. Push every third empty needle to the front using the pattern ruler D. Now take the holder with 1 decker and look at the first row knitted with the main yarn. You will see longer and shorter loops. Pick up the first shorter one with a decker needle and hang this loop onto the first needle hook. Go on to pick up the following longer loop now and hang it into the hook of the empty needle. Continue like this, always hanging the shorter loop on one of the 2 needles where there is already a stitch and hanging the longer loop on the empty needle. Later, when you have finished your knitting, you will cut the last loop at the edge of the contrast yarn and pull the last row of contrast yarn out to separate the contrast yarn from the main knitting. Now bring all the needles into the advanced working position again by guiding the lock once over the needles. Remember, the knitting switch has to be at the back. Take the lock from the needle bed at the left side and put it on the needle bed again at the right side where the yarn is. Now you can go on knitting stocking stitch or a pattern. You can knit a tuck stitch pattern very easily. Start with 2 rows of stocking stitch. Now take the pattern ruler DE with the E side facing your knitting machine. Start with the second needle in the advanced working position on the right and push every 4th needle with the pattern ruler right to the front until the needle foot touches the front rail. These needles are now in the rest position. Knit 3 rows of stocking stitch while these needles remain in the rest position. Now push the needles in the rest position back to the advanced working position. Knit 1 row of stocking stitch. Using the pattern ruler with the E side facing the needles and starting with the 4th needle from the right, push every 4th needle to the front into rest position. Knit 3 more rows. Push the needles from the rest position back to the advanced working position and knit 1 row. To get some practice, go on knitting the tuck stitch pattern, always alternating the needles that you push to the rest position to form the tucks. That means first start again with the 2nd needle from the right edge and next time with the 4th needle. Intarsia knitting is another pattern which is very much appreciated as it allows several colors of yarn to be knitted in a single row without any floats appearing on the purl side. You will need as many small balls of yarn as there are blocks of color. The different yarns are laid over the needles starting at the lock side, just as it is done for one color stocking stitch. Make sure there is yarn in every needle head. For the next row, start laying the yarn over the needles from the other side. Where two colors of yarn meet, they have to be crossed to avoid holes. According to the way you lay your yarns, you can create any kind of surface. To practice, use the diagram on page 22 of your knitting book. Follow it to get the knack of this attractive technique. We wish you many happy hours of creative knitting with your new knitting machine.